I was recently watching A Christmas Carol, the 1951 version with Alistair Sim, and I wasn't watching it for commentary. This wasn't research, this wasn't content planning. This was just Christmas. And then I heard a line I'd never really heard before. Not because it was whispered, but because it's something we no longer expect to hear at all. The ghost of Christmas Present is speaking to Scrooge, and he says,
"So is it true of the child born in Bethlehem. He does not live in men's hearts only one day of the year, but in all the days of the year. You have chosen not to seek him in your heart. Therefore you shall come with me and seek him in the hearts of men of goodwill."
That stopped me cold, because that isn't sentiment. That isn't metaphor. That is a direct statement about Jesus Christ, spoken plainly without apology in a mainstream Christmas film. And it's not even delivered by a preacher. It's delivered by a character the audience already trusts as a moral authority. What struck me wasn't just what he said, but how normal it clearly was to say it. There's no dramatic pause for controversy, no nervous softening, no attempt to universalize it into something vague. The film assumes the audience understands who the child born in Bethlehem is, and more importantly, that whether or not he lives in your heart actually matters. That assumption alone tells us something profound about the culture this film came from. Because the rebuke isn't, "Scrooge, you didn't celebrate Christmas correctly." It's, "You chose not to seek him." That places responsibility squarely on the individual heart, a concept modern storytelling almost never touches. And remember, this wasn't marketed as a Christian movie. This was a Christmas movie for families, for general audiences. Which means references like this weren't considered risky, they were considered appropriate. Christmas wasn't just a season, it was a reminder. And Jesus wasn't treated as a seasonal symbol. He was treated as a living presence people could ignore or seek. That's a category we've quietly lost. Today, Christmas films are often filled with warmth, kindness, and generosity, but they carefully avoid the source of those ideas. They borrow the fruit while removing the root. And what's fascinating is that nothing about this line feels harsh. It's calm, it's reflective, it's matter of fact, which tells us something else. The culture didn't feel the need to defend the mention of Christ because his place in the story was already understood. And that raises a question worth asking. If this kind of language was once normal, not confrontational, not divisive, then what changed? Not overnight, not with one decision, but slowly, quietly, edit by edit. Now, the next film may be a little bit more on the nose than A Christmas Carol, but it's worth mentioning because of what it assumes about the audience. It's a Wonderful Life is often remembered as sentimental, cozy, and safe. But what we forget is how openly it treats prayer and who that prayer is directed to. Early in the film, we hear people praying for George Bailey, not in a symbolic sense, not in a vague spiritual way. They are praying to God, and God is listening. Later, at his lowest moment, George cries out, "Father in heaven."
Dear Father in heaven, I'm not a praying man, but if you're up there and you can hear me, show me the way.
This is not poetic language. That's direct address. And what's striking isn't just that the line exists, it's that the film doesn't stop to explain it. There's no hesitation, no softening, no concern that the audience might be uncomfortable. The prayer isn't treated as extraordinary. It's treated as natural, which tells us something important. The filmmakers weren't assuming that every viewer was deeply religious, but they were assuming a shared understanding of faith. They assumed the audience understood who God is, what prayer means, and why someone in despair might cry out to him. That shared language made moments like this possible. And it goes beyond prayer. The film assumes heaven is ordered, angels have purpose, and human life has meaning beyond circumstance. None of this is defended. None of it's framed ironically. It's simply part of the world the story inhabits. And that's the distinction worth noticing. This isn't about assuming belief. It's about assuming familiarity. Faith wasn't foreign to the audience. It wasn't awkward. It didn't need translation. It was part of the cultural vocabulary, which makes a film like this possible and makes its absence today noticeable. Because modern films might still gesture toward hope, meaning, and connection, but they're very careful about where those things come from. And when you place It's a Wonderful Life next to A Christmas Carol, a pattern starts to emerge. Faith wasn't hidden, it wasn't cordoned off, and it certainly wasn't treated as something that needed a warning label. It simply existed inside the story, inside the language, and inside the assumptions of the audience watching. And that brings us to a film that takes this assumption even further. Older films didn't just reference Jesus, they assumed him. And there may be no clearer example of that than Ben-Hur. What's fascinating about Ben-Hur isn't that Jesus is in the film, it's how he's in the film. Jesus is never introduced. No explanatory dialogue, no theological setup. The camera avoids his face entirely, showing him from behind, in silhouette or partially obscured. And yet the audience is expected to know exactly who he is. There's a scene early in the film that says everything. Judah Ben-Hur is being marched through the desert as a prisoner, exhausted, beaten, and nearly collapsed. A Roman guard knocks the cup out of his hands. And then a man steps forward and gives him water. No sermon, no announcement, just compassion. The Roman guard reacts with fear, not confusion, which tells us something important. The authority of Jesus is already understood, even by those enforcing the empire. The film doesn't explain why this moment matters. It assumes the audience understands that mercy, freely given, is not weakness, and that this man is different. And that assumption is key, because Ben-Hur trusts the viewer with theological meaning. It doesn't reduce Jesus to a symbol. It doesn't turn him into a plot device. It allows his presence to quietly reshape everything around him. By the time we reach the crucifixion scene, the story doesn't ask us to decide what we think about Christ. It assumes the question has already been answered. That kind of storytelling only works in a culture where Jesus doesn't need defending, because he hasn't yet been pushed to the margins. And that's the shift worth noticing. In modern films, if Jesus appears at all, he must be explained, reframed, softened, or reinterpreted. In Ben-Hur, he's simply there, and the weight of his presence does the work. What this tells us is that older filmmakers weren't trying to make religious movies. They were telling human stories in a culture where Christianity was part of the shared moral language. Jesus wasn't controversial, he was foundational, which raises an uncomfortable question. If a film from 1959 could assume the audience recognized Christ without explanation, why would that assumption feel impossible today? Because somewhere along the way, we didn't just remove religious language from stories. We removed the expectation that truth could be shared rather than negotiated. In A Christmas Carol, Jesus is mentioned plainly, without hesitation. In It's a Wonderful Life, prayer and heaven are assumed, not explained. And in Ben-Hur, Christ needs no introduction at all. These weren't religious films trying to make a point. They were stories told in a culture where faith was part of the shared language. Not enforced, not spotlighted, simply understood. And that's the difference worth noticing. Faith didn't disappear from film overnight. It didn't vanish because of one decision or one generation. It faded slowly as assumptions changed, as language narrowed, as stories learned to avoid what once felt natural. This isn't about going backward, and it isn't about demanding something in return. It's about recognizing what was once there and asking why its absence feels so noticeable now. Hey, thanks for spending a few minutes thinking this through with me. If you found this reflection helpful or thought-provoking, you're welcome to subscribe and continue the conversation here on Tru-Talk Radio. Until next time, take care and thanks for watching.